So my name is Vidya Murthy. I serve as COO here at MedCrypt. MedCrypt happens to own the MedISAL, which is why we're bringing more content to the MedISAL population based on everything we have learned. A couple housekeeping things. Please don't hesitate to ask questions at any point during this. There's a chat, I believe, or if you want to talk, I think you can raise your hand and we can figure out how to unmute you. And other than that, let's hop right into this. We will share the slides and the recording afterwards, along with a blog with some additional resources if we don't get through everything in this session. So, introducing the SBOM. Last time we talked about the notion of why we are doing this and kind of the philosophical method of approaching doing software bill of materials. When we get more into the actual SBOM, the intention is generating it in this session and talking more about generation and what that actually means and answering some of the common pitfalls that I think we see. So if we look at the objective definition of what a software bill of materials is, it just says comprehensive inventory. But what is comprehensive, right? That tends to be one of the common questions we get, like what is enough? And what is the information that is quote unquote needed in an SBOM versus nice to haves, right? And so we'll get into a little bit around what is actually included in the SBOM, its role in vulnerability management. For many folks, generating an SBOM can be perceived as a tick the box, so we can provide it to a customer, or provide it to the FDA, or whatever else. But it actually can play a critical role in a vulnerability management program. And then the benefits of having a software bill of materials that's accurate and usable is really important to understand. It's kind of the why of why invest in generating quickly. And basically, we'll work through kind of all of this in the context of being a device manufacturer that has to submit to the FDA because there are clear requirements that we all face. So why SBOM? The first one, FDA mandate. The FDA has a requirement that says you must submit a software bill of materials for devices, software connectivity, and security risks. This includes customers also. So a lot of hospitals are asking for the same type of content as what is being provided to the FDA. Customers meaning like health systems or consumers of devices that often want an SBOM. Now, one of the age-old conference hallway debates is, what do people do with these SBOMs? Let's table that for a minute and just focus on, okay, I've decided that I want to generate an SBOM and go down this path of submitting it for regulatory purposes and talking about what that means. One of the core things we see a lot of folks is if I generate at one point in time, do I have to generate again and keep on keeping this up to date? Part of the purpose of all of this, right, is to have awareness of vulnerabilities that impact your device. So if you have updates to a device, minor, major, that get you onto different versions of a component, the vulnerabilities that apply to those components could change. And so it becomes relevant to have timely reflections on what your SBOM looks like and the different versions that you have in the field. One of the regular comments that we get from device manufacturers is, hey, I put out an update to my device. I don't know that my hospital system ever applied that patch. Therefore, I'm not sure which version they're on. Or I know that they're running on an old version and they refuse to update it for whatever reason. And therefore, I now need to track multiple versions of the same product software bill of materials. It becomes important to have a naming convention and how you track those things, but also important that you actually track all the different versions because those are your fielded devices and you need to be able to answer the question, if imagine another WannaCry happens, hey, am I impacted? And understanding which components are actively out in the field. So when we think about what is in an SBOM, when this first started, call it 8 years ago, I don't know that everybody agreed on what should be included in an SBOM. But since then, we've seen the NTIA really take a stance and put out what should be included in the minimum elements. So minimum is the key term there, right? There's a lot of other stuff that often can end up here, including things like license information. But what is core and required is identified from the NTIA's minimum elements. They're outlined here, and some definition of how these relate to each other, how these are included, is part of what we expect to see in an SBOM that is generated. There's additional things that have to be considered when we think about devices. The FDA wants it to be a machine-readable SBOM, so when you submit it to them, they expect it to be consumable in either SPDX or CycloneDX. Those are the two that we most frequently see. They don't explicitly say which format they want, but they say it has to be machine-readable, and you have to consider that in what you're providing. Similarly, the depth question is one that we regularly get, right? how many components down do I have to keep providing a software bill of material for? Imagine you have a library, has 100 components, each of those then has 100 points each. Is the expectation that you really go through that entire chain and have every single one of those? I think the answer is reasonable. So within reason is what the FDA has historically said. Now, in a dream scenario, absolutely, you should go down to the very last thing and be able to identify every single facet. I think the hope that most people have right now is that they can generate something that's mostly accurate and reflective of their main components, including third parties. So say you're running third party libraries or anything else or open source stuff, you'd want all that to be included as well. There are some unique considerations for the EU. Currently, EU MDR does not explicitly state that they want an SBOM. We see the expectation that by 2027, there will be in the EU Cyber Resilience Act, something to introduce mandatory SBOM requirements. What we have historically seen is that EU MDR tends to follow, the EU in general tends to follow the same standards in terms of components included in an SBOM. So where the NTIA has defined what an SBOM is, it is expected that the EU will also have those same components as part of their minimum requirements. What we do see is that with this December 2027 deadline, that you also need to have a machine readable format. And they're a little more explicit about the degree to which you have to go down. They say at least the top level dependencies. So that's kind of one fork down in terms of what you are capturing in your SBOM. Now, again, this isn't finalized. It's not out there yet, and it could change. But if you're going by contours, the hope is very much that what you generate for the FDA could then also be used in the EU. Now, with all that being said, the EU does still have an expectation that you have a post-market management plan. Now, how can you do that without knowing your components? It's pretty hard to imagine, right? But if you did, in fact, have an SBOM in place and you could use that to justify what your post-market vigilance strategy is, that's likely a compelling story that could help you get through the EU's expectations. So how do we get started? At its highest level, right? We got to identify all components. That means every piece of software that's going in, whether it's third party, whether it's open source, whether it's something you wrote by yourself. Some folks have made the argument about including proprietary software and rather not including it, mostly because if there is proprietary software that has been written, it is unlikely that a vulnerability will be disclosed against that proprietary software through something like the National Vulnerability Database. And so if the argument is, hey, I'm going to use my software bill of materials, compare it against the National Vulnerability Database and hope that it all matches, it's improbable that proprietary would be included. But per best practice and what the FDA is hoping for, they want to see those components included as well. The third party stuff, you need to include things like operating systems. You want to have libraries, frameworks, all sorts of things that include the version for each of those, because it becomes important to be able to track. Similar for open source things, you want to be able to have libraries and their dependencies, and that is, again, to enable that vulnerability tracking. One of the questions you'll want to ask yourself before you get started with generation is, what format should we use? There's really two that have dominated here. We have SPDX and CycloneDX. The two of those have really taken the forefront in terms of what is preferred. Either one is accepted by the FDA. We see most health systems responsive to that as well. And the choice between the two, there's a little bit that is important in determining kind of what you ultimately want to build out from a program perspective. We'll go into each a little bit more here. So here's kind of the considerations for each of these, right? SPDX has a really strong foundation in license compliance, which, again, is not one of the things that the FDA expects you to track in your SBOM. However, if it's something that you are using for operational purposes, that might be a way for you to kind of hit two birds with one stone and be able to track it that way. CycloneDX is definitely more security centric and what will also serve that purpose as well, but it doesn't lend itself to license tracking. Adoption, both are really widely used. I think both really have a lot of tooling that's out there and able to support it, and you can certainly go down the path of building one and converting into another format if you need to do that to use a specific tool or for whatever need. CycloneDX could be a better fit for devices if you have hardware included in your software bill of materials or machine learning type of things, because it has a little bit more broader support. Again, is the FDA asking for your hardware to be included in their minimum? No, they are not. There was a lot of debate about including it in the long term, and we're likely going to see some maturation around hardware in the future once the next version of the post-market guidance comes out. In terms of machine learning, the FDA has recently introduced their guidance right around AI and LLM management. Now, while they're not explicitly saying we need to see an SBOM for LLMs, I think it's probably expected in the future that there will be some version of that would likely come down. So say you go down the path and you want to manually generate it. So there's some challenges and limitations when you try to manually do this. It's quite time consuming, not only on the first iteration, but for subsequent versions and updates. You might face challenges with trying to maintain versioning and accuracy over time. It's totally still an option and very much acceptable. Imagine you're running something on bare metal and you know the number of components off the back of your head. Like, of course, then it makes sense to just manually generate it and go from there, right? But more than anything, you want to make sure that you can somehow justify that your manual approach was comprehensive and how you built it is in fact sufficient. So say I go down this path and I build it into a spreadsheet and it's not an SPDX or CycloneDX, you need to be able to then come up with a way to generate into a machine readable format that can then be used in your FDA submission. Other alternative, right? We use an automated tool. So you want to think about, hey, in my development process, is there something as part of my CI/CD pipeline that potentially has a software composition analysis tool included in it? Think something, if you've heard of Black Duck or similar, that's one of the most common SCA tools that we see out there. That can be a spot to start. It tends to be a little bit more developmental centric as opposed to security centric. So it can get you some components of this, and oftentimes that can be a what an engineering team can say is, hey, we can meet this expectation by giving you the output from our SCA tool. That could work in terms of a place to start in terms of generation. There's also a bunch of package managers out there, and there's a lot of build tools that could work. So you want to think about whether in your tech stack, you could use some of these tools to generate your SBOM. Now, we ourselves have a lot of documentation out there in terms of tooling that could be available. I think there's links later in this deck that will speak to that. If not, well, I'm sure it's in the email that goes out afterwards. But the tooling has gotten a lot better over the last few years here, and there's a lot of options available for generating on your own. It can still be a little bit difficult, even if you first generate, to then maintain it. Like the third chevron talks about, this automatic generation for over time. So over time, there are updates to software, there are changes to builds, there are patches that happen, vulnerabilities that get addressed. All these things have to somehow be reflected in your next SBOM. And so making sure that whatever process you put into place allows for updatability becomes increasingly important, especially if you find yourself in a situation where you're saying, hey, I have multiple versions of this device fielded. How do I know which version I need to track and apply patching to or otherwise? The last one is thinking about how you can use data across different tools and systems. A lot of times, folks will have a little bit of a disparate bundling of tools. So whether you have one place that generates your SBOM, another that monitors it, another that then triages for remediation, and then another one that says, hey, we need to go back and update whatever library because we found a component that is actively being exploited and the FDA says we have to do something about it the next 90 days. Because you have a variety of tools often involved in that, different teams as well, you need to figure out how all these folks are going to collaborate together. And that can often mean you need to have an SBOM that is in a format that can be used by multiple tools. So some of the best practices that we've seen that end up being pretty important for folks, right? Just starting off with completeness, right? You want a true reflection of your inventory. And what we find is most folks end up with a combination of the manual and the automated. So you can automatically generate your SBOM based on the tooling that you have. And then once it's generated, you say, hey, you know what? I know something got missed at the OS level, or I know that something is missing from my SBOM. Modify what you have in place, and then use that version as your true source of truth, and use that for then monitoring purchases throughout your vulnerability management program. Nested dependencies, like I said, this becomes a little bit of a never-ending loop if you really keep going and going. You ultimately want to get to a point that you understand the entire supply chain, and that includes understanding all nested dependencies, including transitive vulnerabilities. So that means if something kind of mirrors up and you end up having it reflected in your ultimate total risk perspective, that's another point of concern. Again, does the FDA explicitly say how far you have to go? No. Is there a reasonable amount that I think is being established for folks? I think we see most often a couple layers down is what we're seeing is reasonable to start. But really, more than anything, I think it's about setting up the culture of, hey, we have to track this thing. We need to update this thing. We need to monitor for vulnerabilities, and ensuring that kind of all the different parts of that process are working together to actually work on against the truth of what you need to achieve here. The other bit, proprietary and third-party components, right? You often end up with engineering being somewhat isolated from the security team when it comes to something like SBOM monitoring, and what a developer is driven by in terms of applying updates to is not always the same as what a security person is driven by. So making sure that both sides of that party are able to talk to each other about why they understand the implication of a security finding and how it impacts the device is increasingly important. And then the last one, right, is really around continuous monitoring. As much as I would love for security to be one and done, that is not the universe we live in, right? Vulnerabilities are constantly coming out. Updates to devices are constantly happening. You need to be able to know what your SBOM is in this moment, and not just kind of the version that originally got submitted to the FDA. Common pitfalls we see. So one of the core things we often find is this disconnect from development. I alluded to it, right? The generation of the SBOM is different than the software lifecycle. That can end up just making everything harder for everyone. And there's a lot to benefit from by integrating and working with your SDLC group and somehow finding a way to embed this need for security purposes and quality management system documentation purposes to really get that aligned, because it will make life a little bit easier in the long term. Another big one, right? What we wouldn't all be here if we didn't care about security, obviously. One of the things that often is not prioritized for SBOM generation is licensing, because it's not one of those NTIA elements, but from an operational perspective, it can actually become really relevant. So if you completely ignore the licensing and you say, hey, we're going to solve the first problem first, which is totally fair and a strategy that we've seen many device makers successfully proceed with, you just have to know that licensing is not something that, should somebody come down the line and say, hey, I care about the license term here, and you say, I just don't have that data right now, that could be something that you need to work on. Metadata, false matches, these are hard things. The false matches are a huge pitfall that we find with SBOM generation. Naming convention for components is a mess for many, right? You have constant changing of vendors, vendor naming conventions, unfortunately not consistent at all. And so really being able to understand over time what you actually have in your SBOM and making sure you understand that naming convention so that you can then adjust it to your monitoring strategy become increasingly important. And really the notion of let me just brute force this the first time and that's enough, that could get you to submit to the FDA, sure. But over time, the level of effort to maintain that and then avoid any of the manual processes of monitoring becomes very hard to sustain and justify. So we talk about the generation a lot here, right? So once we've generated an SBOM, that's literally the beginning of the vulnerability lifecycle, right? There's so much that comes after that you might say, well, why are we talking about the rest? Like, shouldn't we just focus on generation? Unfortunately, what I basically was trying to convey, if we do a poor job of generation at the onset, the rest of the program will never meet the needs. If you miss components or you've misnamed a component, or things are not reflective of the final version and there's libraries in it that aren't being used, you could end up with a world of pain that you then need to manage. Imagine, and this is based on a true story, a device maker generated an SBOM for a legacy device, tried to match it against the National Vulnerability Database, and ended up with more than 1,000 hits in terms of matches. Now, they then had to figure out, hey, is this a naming issue? Are these actual matches? Is this all relevant to what I need to apply? And it was almost to the point of the volume being so much, they couldn't even start, right? It was almost not worth the effort, and they had to revamp how they generated. And they ultimately figured out, oh yeah, we had a ton of libraries in here with nested components that we never actually used, right? That library wasn't actually used. It was just legacy data from however many iterations back when somebody first made this device. So this is why I guess the harping is on generate accurately and make sure that you maintain that over time to really ensure kind of the rest of the process is rightfully sized to effort and value. We have some additional sources in terms of tooling and building an SBOM and other common issues that we see folks run into. We'll put that in the version of the slides that goes out, and make sure you have links to tools. If you need help with some of the open source tooling that's out there, you aren't sure how to start based on your tech stack, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to help where we can. And other than that, I think the benefits here are, I think, relatively straightforward, right? It just makes the rest of the program for vulnerability management a little bit easier. And if you're able to, for those who even remember Log4j, right? The FDA came out, I think it was right around Christmas, and they said, hey, device makers, we need you to tell us if you're impacted or not. And a lot of folks said, I don't even have an SBOM. How am I supposed to tell you if I'm impacted? And it became kind of this mad dash of going around trying to understand who's running Log4j and then trying to figure out where they would be impacted or not. And that's just painful for everyone, right? So being able to respond rapidly and accurately should something arise is likely the most obvious impact here. And having it from a compliance perspective is obviously important as well, so that your quality system is happy, that you're able to generate FDA-ready reports so that you can put it in your updates and your submissions, and being able to maintain it at the level of effort that is reasonable and aligns with your company's risk is really important as well. So in conclusion, should you have any struggles with generating an SBOM or need any additional guidance, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help, and hopefully this has been informative, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next one. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll give that a couple minutes. Otherwise, thank you all for joining. I appreciate it.
Hey, Vidya, I see you have some questions in the chat.
Oh, I totally missed it. Thank you. In the FDA pre-bar guides, they reference that you should have a software level of support and end of support date for each component, and that information should be in the SBOM or provided separately. Do you typically recommend including this in an SBOM? Do you have any recommendations for tracking this information? It's not readily available from third-party software suppliers. Let's take the last part of that first. So third-party suppliers, notoriously, right, you're not going to have end-of-life dates or end of support. The FDA has historically taken a stance where they want you to find a way. So something like a NetRise or some level of effort to say when your internal team will stop supporting, and being able to answer in that component has appeased them from that perspective. In terms of recommendations for tracking, I fully support putting it in the SBOM. That's exactly how kind of we deal with it in our solution. We believe that if everything is kind of in the same home, you're able to triage what you need fastest and easiest. And then the last one, while the FDA says it could be provided separately, you then end up in kind of this crazy matching game of trying to justify what is tracked where. And as we're all facing, the FDA is under a level of scrutiny right now that perhaps makes it a little bit harder to get a clear answer. And that can just, adding that complication to it, I think could be more detrimental to a device maker than just including it in your same output. In terms of false matches naming conventions, how do you typically determine if the CP Perl you have for your component is correct? Will return vulnerabilities accurately through SBOM scanning for a component. Do you have a recommendation for how to validate SBOM monitoring tools to ensure they are working correctly? It seems like for some components, the naming convention is not completely consistent. It's hard to know if the ID included in the SBOM will actually return reported vulnerabilities correctly. You're absolutely correct. So one of the biggest things, especially if you're running Windows, imagine, right, having the Perl for some of that is absolutely critical to understand how patching impacts and KBs and everything that goes with it. So Windows is its own kind of beast to know if you're impacted or not. To be totally honest, we have a couple of white papers out there where we have compared our solution against ones out there, common source, open source ones, so your dependency tracks of the world. The biggest headache is if you start with a messy software bill of material, you're just going to be struggling at every other step of vulnerability management. So I guess my biggest recommendation for monitoring is you could go down the path of going in the NVD. You could use the MedISAL's portal and start looking for components. That's probably a good place to start practically. Otherwise, I would genuinely look for vulnerabilities that you know to be in a component of your device. Every library has something out there, right? And see if naming conventions match. And then that would be just a good start. Just start with one, right? And then you can get a sense of how your tooling matches. And I'm happy I can add that white paper and the link to a couple of those comparisons that we have in the deck before we send it out so that you can point to that and see if that helps you at all. Recommendation for tooling. Yes, we have a couple of blogs. I think the middle one on that last screen points to tooling that we have, but I will make sure it's obviously written, if not already in there, to point to the list. We have a list of open source tooling that you have out there that can be used for generation. I think I got them all. Kate, did I?
Yep, that looks like all the questions.
Okay, great. If when the deck goes out, you're saying, hey, I still can't find the tooling, just respond to it and I can get you the detailed list if it's not in there. But I will make sure I put it into the next update. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the next one. Keep well.